Hi, I'm Pastor Kurt, and this is your 5-minute Bible study. Today, we're going to be looking at 2 Kings chapter 25. This is the fall of the kingdom of Judah. In the previous video, I talked about how the kingdom of Israel in the north had been overtaken by the Assyrians, leaving only the kingdom of Judah in the south. The kingdom of Israel was taken over because the kings of Israel did not live the way God wanted them to live. And their captivity and their exile was punishment. Then we heard a warning to the king in Judah that the same thing was going to happen to them. Well, at this point, it happens. The king in Judah at this point is King Zedekiah, and the king in Babylon is King Nebuchadnezzar II. In the year 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar destroys the temple in Jerusalem and levels the entire city. This is a key moment in the history of God's people. Because the temple, if you remember, was built by King David's son Solomon. This was the holiest place for the people. This was where they went to offer sacrifices to God. And God had promised that someone from the line of David would always be on the throne. But now, Jerusalem and the kingdom of Judah have been destroyed. The people have been taken into exile, which became known as the Babylonian exile. So now the people are away from their homeland, they're living in a foreign land, and they wonder about the promise that God made to David. In other words, how could God let this happen? God promised us that someone from David's line would always be on the throne. But now our kingdom has been taken over, and we are now living in exile. What in the world is going on? Has God abandoned us? Is God no longer faithful to God's promise? These are the kinds of questions the people were asking, because this was a very dark time for the people. They're in exile. They're no longer living in their homeland. And so they're wondering what in the world is going on. For Christians, when we hear God's promise to David, we know that God always keeps God's promises. And we know that someone from David's line will always be king, because we think of Jesus. Jesus is from David's line. But in that moment when you're taken into exile and you feel completely abandoned, you wonder, where is God in this? What is God up to? God did not abandon God's people. Even when the people were taken into exile for all those years, because the exile lasted a long time, God did not abandon God's people. God was still with them. Think about dark times that you have been in. Think about times where you feel like you are in a metaphorical exile. Has God abandoned you? No, of course not. God is still with you. I know in that moment that can be hard to see. It can be hard to trust God when it feels like your world is falling apart, when it seems like everything you held dear has been destroyed. It can be really, really hard to trust God at that point. This is what the people in exile were feeling too. But just as God remained with them in one of their darkest times, so also God remains with you in your dark times too. Just because life isn't going well for you, that doesn't mean God's abandoned you. God is with you in the good times and in the bad times. And God is always faithful to God's promises. Just like God was faithful to the promises to the people back then, so God remains faithful to the promises for us today too. there's your 5-minute Bible study for the day. Please remember to like, comment, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.